All right. So tonight is a very special night because not only do we have two fabulous writers here with us, but we also have two very dear friends of Chevalier's books. First, we have Stephanie Hammer. She is a six-time Pushcart Prize nominee in fiction, nonfiction, and poetry. Her titles include Sex with Buildings, Delicious Strangeness, and The Puppet Turners of Narrow Interior. Stephanie is also the managing editor of Shark Reef Literary Magazine and sits on the advisory board of Writers Block LA. She teaches creative writing at Hugo House Seattle and the Inlandia Institute Riverside. But tonight, Stephanie is here to celebrate and interrogate our main star and featured poet, Rich Ferguson, for his beautiful new collection, Everything is Radiant Between the Hates. He's also a Pushcart Prize nominated poet, and Rich has shared the stage before with Patti Smith, Wanda Coleman, Moby, and many other esteemed performers. Rich has also been selected by the National Beat Poetry Foundation, Inc. to serve as the State of California Beat Poet Laureate from 2020 to 2022. Without further ado, I'd like to hand over the digital stage to Stephanie, who will take us into the next portion of our evening. Stephanie, if you would please take it away.
Thank you so much, Teresa. And hi, everybody. I'm seeing California friends, and I'm seeing Washington State, Puget Sound friends. The left coast rules. It's so wonderful to be with you in this beautiful cyber bookstore, which is Chevalier's Books, which is such a wonderful place. And I'm so thrilled to be with one of my absolute favorite people and poets, Rich Ferguson. Before we get into it, we're going to have some conversation. We can hopefully get Rich to perform a poem. It could happen. And do a Q&A. I was talking to Rich about this, and we both want to send a spiritual shout out to our literary matchmaker, the wonderful Liz Neustadt, who was the manager of Chevalier's Books and who passed away just this past December. Rich and I adore Liz. She loved us and she loved poetry. She was a ferocious defender and advocate for poets and for poetry books. And so we'd like to dedicate our conversation to her memory. And we have some exciting news about her and something in her honor that'll come later on in our program. But let's get into it. And Rich, it's so great to see you. How are you doing?
I'm doing well. It's great to see you, Stephanie. Teresa, thank you to you and Chevalier's for hosting this event. And yeah, given everything going on, I'm doing well.
Under COVID related, under those circumstances, you're doing fine.
Yep.
Your book is gorgeous.
Thank you.
My copy arrived recently and I want to talk about it specifically. But first, for the folks who don't know you so well, will you say a little bit about your origin story? How did you get interested in making poetry in the first place?
Well, I've been interested in writing ever since I was really young. You know, as my mom tells it, well, she first got me interested in books, as my mom tells it. Before I could read, we were on a family road trip, and I just started reading the road signs that went by, and my parents looked at one another astonished, like, oh my God, he's reading, you know, and the billboards. Yes, so I love that idea because I love being on the road, traveling, performing. So I love that some of my first words that were read aloud were while on the road, so to say. So that love of reading and writing for that matter has continued throughout my life. When I was in college, like my last semester in college, I took a fiction writing course. In the last week of the class, there was like the ghetto section for poetry. And I just loved that part of the class. And my professor gave me a backhanded compliment at the end of the course. She was like, "You're a much better poet than you are a fiction writer." And I was like, Thank you. And, after that, I ended up, I was playing the drums, practicing in New York City or taking lessons in New York City. Then I packed my car, moved out to California, and ended up in San Francisco, living there before here in LA. And
didn't you heard some famous poet in San Francisco?
Yes.
And I can't remember who it was.
Anne Waldman. So what happened was the first place I stopped in San Francisco, City Lights Book. I picked up Gregory Corso's Gasoline, and I was hooked. And then I saw Anne Waldman read live, and she was really the first poet that inspired me to not have paper in my hand, to just go from memory. And she was fiery, and I just was like, I want to do that, If not that, at least aspire to that.
Right. And for those of you who may not know who Anne Waldman is, she did this wild kind of performance poetry, really kind of spoken wordy, but kind of highbrow. And the thing that I remember seeing that was just a mind blower, and you can find her on YouTube, was she does a piece called A Rogue State, which she almost sings, and she says, I'm in a rogue state. It was just trippy, and it goes on from there. So that was the person who got you interested in doing kind of spoken word.
Really like performance spoken word, I would have to say Anne Waldman. Yeah, I had the good fortune of meeting her at this event at Beyond Baroque. It was put on by Three Rooms Press, and Peter and Kat are out in New York, but they came to LA to do this event. They had put a book together about Burroughs' writings, and Anne Waldman read at the event, and I read at the event, and that was like the first time I'd seen her since those years back in San Francisco. So it was great to reconnect with her and let her know how much, she's inspired me.
Wow, that's so amazing. Well, now speaking of Anne Waldman and speaking of performance, is there any way we could get you to do something for us right now?
Sure. Yeah. And I think you were mentioning maybe, if not this piece exactly, a piece like this, you were going to maybe be doing as a writing activity or something with your students. So this is, sometimes if I get stuck in my writing, I'll sometimes do list poems, and kind of lists sometimes help me to kind of retune the engine and just get words out. So this is one of those. It's called A World of Things. Things we said under our breath, things people have said with their last dying breath, things that drive people to drink, things that made Jesus think, maybe I'm in the wrong line of business, things you can only find in Detroit, things that make you jump for joy, things that make people jump from the Golden Gate Bridge, things you get stuck between your teeth, things you stuck in your ear, up your nose, or up your butt, things that change from ugly to beautiful, things that frighten you, things that enliven you, things to help raise your credit score, things to help lower your cholesterol, things organisms have done to adapt, things that make certain men become priests, things that make certain women wrestle alligators, things serial killers think about. Things you find in a dead man's pockets, things you find in your own pockets, things named after Greek gods, things people have done in the name of God, things that cause acne, things that cause cancer, things to consider before having a baby, things to consider before joining the French Foreign Legion, things you would do if you had wings, things you would do if you had the Green Lantern's power ring, things to help clear out your aura, things to help clear out your orifices, things you should always buy generic, things you've always wanted to know but were afraid to ask, things you see when you look up at the clouds, things your pets do when you're not around, things you can smoke, things you can recycle, things behind the sun, things to help make your car run better, things you find alongside the road, things you find washed up on the beach, things you build, things you compete for, things you do when you're alone in your room. Things you can burn, things you can save, things you can say to get a girl wet, things you can say to get a guy hard, things you can say to get kicked off jury duty, things you can carry, things you can hide, things that decay, things that rejuvenate, things you put into compost piles, things that live under your skin, things you find around Jim Morrison's grave, things your doctor won't tell you, things your parents won't tell you, things your best friend won't tell you, things your lover won't tell you, things that major corporations won't tell you, things the government won't tell you, will never tell you.
I'm clapping on behalf of. Damn, man. I've heard you do that before, and it just kills me every time. And I feel like I hear something different in it every time. And then there's a certain point where I just go, how does he remember all of that? How can he keep track of all of that?
Yeah.
But you write these things out, these poems out first. Is that correct? You write them out and then you memorize them, I guess.
Yes. Yeah. It's the whole memorization process is interesting. I was actually having a conversation about it just recently with a dear friend who I believe is here tonight. And we were talking about memory and the memory palace. And that was a concept that was, created years and many thousands of years ago. The idea of, the way we can incorporate it into our bodies, the idea of a memory palace in our bodies is we can designate certain places in our body where we can store memories or we can store different ideas. And sometimes when I memorize a poem, I can either give it a physical gesture. I can memorize a certain phrase of poetry and assign a certain physical gesture to it, and then do that gesture enough where it becomes muscle memory. So when I perform, the muscle memory is a trigger for my memory, which then remembers the part that I have to go into, and then another gesture can trigger another part of my memory, which triggers another part of the poem. And so
I noticed there's a ring part of this. And so that's one of those, I mean, it's wonderfully dramatic because the ring looks so beautiful. So it's a great visual, but I guess it's also a mnemonic device.
Yep. And also, and it's interesting that you sort of said earlier, so you write these pieces first. I'll write them, and then what I'll do is go back through them and kind of look for connective tissue between the words and the phrases. And I'll see, oh yeah, that thought connects to this thought, which connects to this thought. So I can kind of, when I memorize the piece, I can sort of link and chunk all those together as one continuous sort of train of thought. And though one thought will follow the other one, and then I can go on to my next train of thought. And these phrases connect nicely, and I can chunk those into a new frame of thought.
So it's almost, if I'm understanding you right, it's almost as though writing and speaking were kind of happening. They're not happening at the same time, but they're kind of threading back through each other, so that the writing is helping you think about this as a piece that you're going to speak, but speaking it is also threading back into your thinking about how you're maybe going to revise it.
Yep. No, you're actually, that's very intuitive that you should say that, because that is what happens, actually, because sometimes I'll write a piece and I'll look at it, and when I start approaching it from a performative aspect, I'll look for those places where the writing connects, and there will be certain phrases that I've written. I'm like, yeah, that kind of is like, a stick stuck in the spokes or something. It's not really, it kind of interrupts the flow. I'm going to either take it out altogether or maybe move it to another place. Maybe it connects better to another place. So yeah, that's absolutely right. One sort of informs the other.
That's really interesting, because I think a lot of people who kind of don't know all that much about spoken word, or maybe do, tend to think that that's what it is. It's just all spoken word. There's no writing, and that someone like Auden just kind of wrote and never read his stuff out loud. But really, poetry is that always that mixture, I guess.
Yeah, I've had people come up to me after a reading and say, were you just like reciting that off the top of your head? And to me, that's a really big compliment, because I've embodied a piece of work so much that it literally sounds like conversation. So, and it's like, No, I wasn't saying that. That took like weeks, months to sort of get that to a place where it sounds like conversation.
Yeah, but it does sound very natural. And we're at a bookstore at a poetry reading, and you have a book out, so we figure, okay, that this piece is somehow been crafted in writing. But if you just got up and did it, which I'm sure you, and I know you've done that, it does feel like, oh, this is amazing, but he's just doing this.
Right.
And I guess that opens up something that you and I have talked about before, and that we're both really obsessed with, I think, and that is sort of relationship between poetry and prose.
Yep.
Arguably, your poem, it does sound like conversation. Of course, conversation is generally in prose unless you're in a Shakespeare play.
Right.
I'm wondering, kind of, how does that work for you, the relationship between poetry and prose, as I ask you an impossible question?
Ha ha ha. Well, as that college professor said, poetry comes easier to me than prose. And she kind of had something there. But I did write a novel, New Jersey Me, which came out in between my first collection of poetry, Eighth in Agony, and this collection of poetry. And it was definitely something that had gone through various, incarnations and incantations for a good 10 years or something. It was something I would work on, put away, shelve it, come back to it. Originally, I'd tried writing it as a novel and stories, and then scrapped that, got together with a really good editor, Seth Fisher, once Rare Bird Books, Tyson Cornell wanted to publish it, and basically gutted the novel or the novel and stories idea and rewrote it as a novel in chapters, which actually made it a much better book. But I think poetry has really helped me, and I would love to hear your thoughts on this because I know you do both as well. But for me, the writing poetry and then going back and doing fiction, it really helps to offer a certain economy of words, and a certain economy, but also a certain sense of like lyricism or music. Like I'm gonna like chop this down to its bare essentials, this piece of prose, but in so doing, I also want to make that little paragraph sing, and yeah, so the poetry definitely helps it's kind of like diamonds, poetry is like distilling words and language into these fine diamonds. And then you sort of, once you kind of are able to, or at least aspire to, as I continually try to get better, speaking in that language, then you can kind of take that language and take it over to prose. And hopefully it helps too. Yeah.
Yeah, I love what you said about economy and music. And when you said economy, you were like, and I thought you were going to go, I thought, oh, he's going to talk about space. But then it was like, you went someplace else completely different. You went to music. And of course, yeah, I always forget that you've got this background as a musician. You know, and the drumming piece is because drumming, of course, is about rhythm. And that's what poetry does. It's all about words and rhythm, and using, kind of pairing them back so that the rhythm will really, really work. The other thing I did notice, Rich, is in your collection, which is beautiful, by the way, Moontide Press. They make beautiful books. Is you kind of have it both ways with the poetry and prose question, because you've got some prose poems in this collection.
Yes, I do.
So that's a very elegant way to just go, okay, I don't want to write another novel.
Yeah.
But I do kind of like prose. So how did you decide when a piece was going to be in prose, or when it was going to be in free verse, or did you make that decision? What was that process like?
That's a really good question. And I don't know if I really have I don't know if I was really completely that conscious about it. Like, I'm going to approach this piece from a prose standpoint. I think I just approach it from whatever way feels most natural inside of me, or like where the through line or whatever is taking me. Like, there's a piece called Butt Dialing, for dedicated to a dear friend of mine, poet here in LA, Danny Baker, passed away a year or so ago. But and the way I wrote that was just this sort of long, kind of rantish, sort of prose, kind of fever pitch kind of thing. And that was definitely something that presented itself more sort of a prose-esque sort of way than poetry. And that was just simply because I was trying to tell a story about, and it was all based on this guy, Danny. He had, we saw each other once. In fact, Danny was a big fan of Chevalier's. We would often meet on Larchmont to go to Chevalier's, but we ran into each other on Larchmont once, and he was like, yeah, I got a butt dial from you the other day, you know, and I was like, oh, like, did you hang up? He was like, no, I just let it go for a while. I was kind of curious, like, you know, if something was going to happen. But anyway, just that grain. I love how inspiration comes to us, and that grain just got me writing this whole fevered thing called butt dialing.
I love that idea. And so it's really interesting too, I think for there's some other writers in the room. It's great to be reminded that these things just kind of present themselves organically, and maybe, you know, it may be good not to overthink the form too much. It's like you just start working on it, and it's going to become clear whether it's a prose poem or a free verse thing, or indeed something else. I mean,
or a painting, or something.
Like your novel made it clear to you that it was, even though it was hard for you to write. It's fabulous, by the way. It came out great. I'm sorry it was hard, but it's really good. But your novel made itself clear to you that it was a novel, and that's what it was going to be.
Yep.
Yeah. Let's talk a little bit more about Everything is Radiant Between the Hates. It's got 8 different sections in it.
Yeah.
Quite different from each other. I mean, I almost feel in a wonderful way that it's 8 different books, you know, put into one, compressed, back to the idea of economy, kind of.
Right.
And I'm wondering what came first. What was the sort of inspiration to make this book, and what came first? Which came first?
Which came first, the chicken poem or the egg poem? Well, I was pretty much working on the collection ever since Eighth in Agony was released about, I don't know, 8 years ago or something. And I was just writing poems. And this collection went through various revisions, and I would get to a place where I thought it's ready. And then I'd be like, no, it's not ready. And then it finally got to a place where I just couldn't take it any further. And Eric Moraga, who runs Moontide Press, he was also doing some freelance editing. So I approached him mainly as an editor, but also as a publisher, to see if he would even be interested in the collection. So I approached him as a freelance editor. He ended up really liking it. I had asked him, like, hey, can you think of any publishers that would want to publish this? And he said, well, I would be hesitant because I would actually like to publish it. So I was like, cool. Got those 2 things accomplished. But, you know, I think the sections really became more apparent when I started working with Eric. He told me certain poems. He's like, this poem doesn't work. This poem doesn't work. Maybe think about putting a couple of these poems together. And then he just said, you know what? Why don't you actually just play around with the collection? And that's what I did. I just printed everything out, laid it out on my floor here, and physically took poems and started arranging and rearranging and putting them into different sections. And then as we progressed into the madness of, because this was prior to the real madness of 2020, but as we sort of progressed further into the madness of 2020, and I started writing, you know, some somewhat political poems, or, you know, more socially conscious poems or whatever, some of those sections started to reveal themselves as being their own sections. And so in looking at my own book here, and with my Chevalier's bookmark, I was looking at the sections actually earlier, And, it kind of starts out with sort of, worries but things that I feel that are blessings in my life. And then I go on into a section where I just kind of want to riff on LA, and because there's so much to say about this amazing city. And then the next section is kind of where I sort of go into some of the more political things. And then the next section, the Jim Beyond Good and Evil Tendencies, it was kind of like, that's the section that has world of things and butt dialing. And I kind of wanted to just get into some of the quirks and insanities of life and my life. And then it goes into Everything is Radiant Between the Hates, which is sort of pulling out of the madness and craziness and kind of going a little higher. And then there's In My City of Words, where I was like, I want a section where, we're writers, that's what we do. We love language. We love playing with language. So I wanted to have a part of the collection where it's just like, you know what, I'm going to play with language. This is going to be my little playground section of the book where I'm just going to play with language and have fun with it. And then an abridged history of lips, where it's just kind of, I'm going to write some love poems. Here are some, just poems about sex, love, whatever. And then I end with my section, Evelyn Everything, which is dedicated to my daughter. And the book is, in fact, dedicated to her. So I knew that was where I wanted to end the book. It was just a matter of like, okay, how do I get to her?
Wow. There's so much that you've talked about that I would love to talk more about. But I'm really interested in your point. We hadn't talked about this before, but your point of kind of what an editor can do for you, not in terms of practicality, that of course, but in terms of kind of creating space for you to create. First by saying, though these don't work, that sometimes we need to hear, and we need to hear that from somebody who isn't a writer, or they're not wearing their writer hat. They're wearing their editor hat.
Yeah.
And that's helpful, because it can kind of clear. It's like, okay, those don't work, so they're not going in, and I don't need to worry about them anymore. But that invitation to just, I'm play with the collection. So think, this stuff, no, but here's the rest, some other stuff. Think bigger now about this, and kind of how liberating that can be, I guess.
Yeah, it's very liberating. It also helps sometimes if that editor isn't like, you're not involved with that person relationship, or they're kind of this like a therapist, they're sort of a neutral figure. That kind of can help sometimes too. But I really found that, like, both with Eric Morago and Seth Fisher, who edited New Jersey Me, those were a couple of the best experiences I had with editors, because not only were they able to kind of look at my work with a critical eye, and really, say, this is what works and why, and this I don't think is working and why, and really have some sound judgment on both sides of the issue. And it's kind of like that idea of like if there's like a forest fire or something, and just all this beautiful, like you were saying, that whole thing, just like you've eliminated, like, just things have gotten torched. All this stuff has gotten torched, but yet if you clear away the brush, if you clear away the weeds and all the burnt stuff, you've now left this whole new area where new things can grow. And I found that most ironically when, mostly Seth, because he was more of a critical editor. Eric was a little bit more open. But with Seth, when he was doing the novel, he would really go through it with a pen, marking this out. No, you need to do this again. But that really inspired me to be a better writer. And it's like, okay, I'm going to take it upon myself to not only try to please him, but to try to please myself, to outdo myself and to better myself as a writer. And I found that, it's kind of like that story with Raymond Carver. He wrote an essay in this beautiful collection of his called Fires. And people asked him, like, hey, why didn't you ever write a novel? And he said, well, I was a young writer. I had a family. I had to get a job. I found that I had certain constraints as a writer. I had a family. I had to do all these things. And I only had this amount of time to write. And I found that for this amount of time, I could write short stories really well. So those limitations really helped he learned how to work within those limitations and to be a master of his craft. And so, I say that because like when Seth would say, this isn't working, it's like, okay, I sort of know certain limitations, or at least the way I was limited as a writer before. Like when he saw this, I'm going to like sort of work within certain limitations, but I'm going to go beyond that and like even better myself within this confine of writing this story. So I found it, I mean, some people, when I tell them I'm working with an editor, some people are like, oh my God, I don't know if I could work with an editor. And it's like, it was like one of the best experiences for me. It helped me to become such a better writer.
And what you're also pointing towards, though, in your sort of narrating about both of your editors, is one really feels this complete trust that you have for them.
Yes, and that's important too.
That's the piece, is that, working with an editor, it depends. You have to really, really be able to trust your editor and have the sense that also that your editor gets what you're doing. And it sounds like your Moontide Press person really just got you and was like, okay, this doesn't. And so when he said, this doesn't work, it wasn't like, oh, it was like, you're amazing. I love your work. And this isn't representing everything you can do.
With Eric.
So let's push it to the side.
Yep.
That's very different than having editors. You're terrible.
Yeah. Well, I mean, Eric did have a few lines, and Seth never approached it like that. He never said, you're terrible. And when I say it was done in a very loving way, and it was done in a way to push me as a writer. But with Eric,
I didn't mean to imply that both of them were amazing. What I'm hearing, and you're talking about them, this real sense of trusting them and feeling that they had your interests at heart and wanted your work to be as amazing as it could be.
Yeah, Eric was really good at, like, if there were certain poems in my collection, he was really good at saying, you know what, you already said this in this poem, and in fact, you said it better in this other poem, so you really don't need this other poem because it's redundant. And to leave this in, you're actually taking away from what you said in the other poem, so just take it out.
Yeah, totally. And we do, of course, as writers,
yes, we do.
Tend to write about the same things over and over and over again.
Yes.
So we need that person to go, it's great that you're doing that, but here's the best example of that.
It's true.
This is number 2, this is number 4, and this is like maybe number 100. It's good to get that reality check. The other thing that I loved that you talked about with the kind of getting the manuscript organized process, which is I do too, is it's very old school, is particularly if you're doing poems or even short essays or flash fiction, is to print it all out and lay it all out on the floor or on a table or whatever and look at it. Mm-hmm. That's really, I think for a lot of us, that's the easiest way to figure out how it's to get organized. So Rich, so you did the organizing into the sections for this book. That was kind of your thing?
Kind of, yeah. And then I would run them by Eric and have him look at it and say, hey, Eric, what do you think of this organization? And he would have a couple suggestions, maybe this or this. But yeah, it was the initial organization was me, and Eric was really good about that. He trusted me. Go play, go have fun. We're going to do this. Just go play for a while. See what you come up with. So he was really good with just trusting me. And you really nailed it earlier when you said trust. And that's really important, like with an editor or a publisher for that matter, to have that mutual trust where they trust you as a writer and you trust them as a publisher or an editor because they are, taking that child of yours and bringing it into the world or helping you bring it into the world or whatever. And so Eric was really good about offering me that freedom of just go play for a while. I trust you can do this, and then check back in with me in a couple months and we'll see what you come up with. We'll go from there.
Now I have still staying with the collection. I have a little bit of a different question. The beginning poems of, and some of the middle ones too, of this collection are actually pretty dark. But then we end up with this incredible final section that is about your daughter. And
Yeah.
I want to know how being a dad has changed you as a poet.
Quite a bit.
I didn't know I was going to ask you that, so I have to, I have to surprise you a little bit.
Yeah. Well, I have to say that, I'm one of those people that came into fatherhood a bit late in life, because I was one of those people that was of the mind that I've got my music, I've got my writing, I've got my art, and if I have a child, it's gonna be, I'm not gonna have time to do my stuff, and I kind of worked under that assumption for quite a number of years. But, when I eventually was presented with fatherhood, it became one of the, greatest blessings, that I would come to discover. It would take me a little while to realize it, but, rather than closing me up as a person or a writer, my daughter has really opened me up, has opened up my heart, has really made me, and even some of the pieces in the collection, even in some of the sections that aren't necessarily about her per se, but even some of the more socially conscious pieces, because of my daughter, I think about the world in different ways now, and I'm more concerned about the future of the world because she's going to be in this world long after I am, and so I care more, I care more now about, preservation of the earth and things like that. So really, she's running through a lot of how I think and how I write these days, even if I'm not directly writing about her.
I totally feel that. And that makes me wonder about something amazing that you do on Facebook. And everybody, we can have the critical feelings we have about Facebook, many of us do, but some artists hack Facebook in really amazing ways. And Rich, you're one of them, because
thanks.
you offer up, not quite every day, but close.
Yep.
You offer up a poem or a mantra, or maybe they're both, and it just goes out there.
Yep.
And will you talk a little bit about that? What got you in, what started you doing this, and what is that about for you, making these offerings on Facebook?
That's a really good question. And I've thought about it before, and I don't think anyone's ever sort of asked me this question directly, so it's really good. I've been doing it for a few years now, and I think when I first started doing it, I was on Facebook, and I would just see posts by people that were just kind of downer stuff, or they were complaining about this or that, and I just thought to myself, I don't want to do that. Like, I don't want to be that person that just gets on Facebook and like complains about stuff or whatever. Though, I have sort of complained sometimes, but through sort of poetic ways, I suppose, definitely, especially last year. But I kind of set myself this goal of like, what? Just rather than like complaining, just kind of offer up some, like you said, offer up a little poem, offer up kind of a little mantra or prayer sort of thing, and just put that out there. And I just started doing it, and it just sort of stuck. And, the more I kept with it, the more, I got people responding in really nice ways. And I was like, wow, I should actually kind of stick with this. And I've met some really amazing people over Facebook who I met through just them saying, hey, I really like what you're doing here. It's really nice. And so it's so it's hopefully been nice for some people, but it's also been really good for me, one, because it kind of sets this bar where it's like, okay, I need to sit down in my chair back there and write something for Facebook tomorrow, or what, and just put it out there. And, there are some days where, like you said, it's not every day, but I've tried to do most every day, especially like this last year and stuff. But yeah, it's been a lot of fun, and I really appreciate the people that share the posts and things like that, or the comments. It really means a lot.
I guess you're being very, very humble about it, which is part of what I want to call people's attention to, because I think in writing world and writing is a business, and we're here thanks to a wonderful business. But I think this idea of kind of gifting poetry and of poems is kind of this way out of thinking about, well, I got to sell this, but that. And yes, we want to definitely sell Rich's book, but I guess I want to just kind of celebrate that you're really incredibly generous about your poem making, and that you kind of you share these poems with no other object than to share them, and they're incredible, many of them, and I just love that you're doing that. And I can't help but wonder if it's connected somehow to Evelyn.
Oh, yeah. It definitely, that's interesting. You should say that. It definitely is, because I think there's part of me that's working under the premise that this acts, well, not only the book, but like these Facebook posts, these act as kind of like a living journal of my life. And when she gets older, these posts will almost be like diary entries that she can go back and read and say, oh, this is what he was doing back then, or this is what he was thinking. So I think that also, and it's really interesting that you pick up on that, because I think I sort of, she's 4 years old. I think I intuitively kind of pick up like that. Like I said earlier, she kind of runs through a lot of my thought processes and things. So she's a big part of it, because I want to kind of have this living journal.
Well, gosh, you're leaving her an amazing trail of wonderful words for her to discover. And again, if for those of you who are on Facebook, I really invite you to follow Rich, just so that you can receive these quite amazing, almost daily poems. And some of them are prayers, indeed. So they have a kind of a spiritual component that's just incredible. I love that the collection starts in that fairly dark, gritty place, and then ends up someplace really, really light and really beautiful. Do you think we could hear another poem before we move into a Q&A? Or would you like to do one?
How are we doing for time, Teresa? Should we move into the Q? Should we?
I think we could do one more poem, and then maybe get into the Q&A and gather questions in the meantime.
All right, I'll do a short one. This is the title poem, Everything is Radiant Between the Hates. Days booby-trapped with animosity, reeking of gunpowder's acrid bite. When the bass heavy beat of police brutality makes it so you can't breathe, and kids begin the new school year with face masks and bulletproof backpacks. When homegrown terrorists keep getting younger and bullet speech grows louder, when those who perish from shootings, beatings, lynchings, overdose, and disease are reduced to body bag hashtags on social media. So heavy these days when chaos holds sway and pallbearers bear the weight of still another coffin across the worn, cobbled streets of our eyes. In between it all, moments of grace, a kind word, a shared kiss, offering a child tender stick phrases such as please and thank you to illuminate their journey forward. Here, contentment is revealed. Everything is radiant between the hates.
Yay! It was so great to hear that. It's so great to hear. I haven't heard you read it, but perform it before. Wonderful to hear. Teresa, do we have some questions for our artist?
Sure. So thank you, Rich, for sharing that with us.
Thank you, everyone, for being here. And again, Teresa, thank you. Stephanie, thank you.
All right, so let's get into the Q&A portion of our event. If you do have any questions for Rich or Steph about writing or poetry or LA, You can go ahead and just drop them into the chat box. I will see them and I will read them aloud to you, to our guests on your behalf. I'm going to start off with my first question, actually, which is we touched upon the process that you had for organizing this collection in particular, but I'm very curious about how do you know when your collection is complete, where you are beyond adding anything to it or taking it away from it, and you're ready to say, like, this is it. Everything that belongs and everything is radiant between the hates is here, and my hands are off.
Well, I'll offer my thoughts for this collection, and then Stephanie, I'd love to hear your thoughts for your writing. You know, as I had mentioned earlier, I went through so many different versions of this collection, and I didn't know when it was done. There were times I thought it was done. I would give it to a couple friends, and they'd be like, "Yeah, this is good," and just kind of like, "Meh." And I even felt at certain times, "Meh," and it's like, I don't want to release a collection that's meh. So, but I still felt I could, even during some of those times, I felt, you know what, I can still move forward. I can challenge myself to write better poems. But then there was that final wall I hit where I don't know where to go with this. And that was around the time that I met Eric. And that was really, you know, he came into my life at a really good time because he was able to offer that critical eye that I couldn't see. I could no longer see. I was like, I have no objectivity. I don't know where to go with this any longer. So he was able to offer those insights and, you know, to help guide me. And again, you know, he helped to either put on the brakes or, you know, step on the gas and we went back and forth for months, like, you know, maybe try writing, maybe try to fill out this section a little bit more, or, you know what, you got too much here. Let's take some poems out of this section of the collection. So yeah, he was really good for helping me with that. What about you, Stephanie? How does that work for you?
There we go. I'm back to, you know, this kind of boring idea of having another pair of eyes on your work. I just think having somebody who you trust look through your book is just invaluable. And that person can help you kind of figure out what should stay in and what should go, and also when it's finished. Because sometimes, thank you so much, Teresa. Sometimes it is hard to know, and you've looked at it so many times that, at least for me, I get to a point where I can't see it anymore. I'm like, oh, right, this poem, here it is. You know, is it great? Is it terrible? I don't know. I've looked at it 50 times. So I think that other person is invaluable.
So we've got a couple questions from Romaine Washington, who's asking, what makes the process of writing a novel more difficult for you than writing poetry? And also, have you written any screenplays?
Well, we can both answer that because, yeah, Stephanie, you've written poems and novels, and you've got a novella that maybe you want to talk a little about. I mean, for me, I think the thing that made the novel hard or more of a challenge for me was that through line, you know, creating that story arc and these believable characters and, you know, plot and all yeah, and rising and falling action and climax and resolution. Yeah, all those things. And it's almost like, for me, the more I thought about, like, oh my God, I've got to, like, you know, increase the drama and things here. The more I thought about those things, it was almost like the harder it would get, because it was like and I read all these books, like how to be a fiction writer. And it was like almost like the more I read, the more I got psyched out. And at a certain point, I just had to throw those books away. It's just like, just write the darn novel, just do it. So, yeah. Storyline and things like that make it more challenging for me. And I did, my one and only screenplay that I have written was actually for my novel. After I wrote the novel, I was like, I want to challenge myself to write a screenplay. And what better thing do I know to write a screenplay about but my novel? Dun, dun, dun. So it was fun. I don't know if I'll write another screenplay again, but it was a really good thing to do, because in the novel, so much, you know, there's that interior monologue, blah, blah, blah stuff. And you can't have that stuff has to get stripped away from a screenplay, as screenwriters out there know. So, you're dealing on a whole other level. So that was really cool. How about for you, Stephanie?
I think that's a great point about screenplays. My husband has been after me to take a screenplay writing class for, gosh, as long as I've been writing, it seems like. And by the way, the question comes from an absolutely incredible poet, Romaine, who's got a poetry collection coming out in April. Just saying. So thank you so much. Yay, Romaine, and thank you so much for your question. I think what I'm learning is keep it simple with novels. Don't throw out the writer's journey book, and tell a very simple story. And as I think a bunch of you know, I'm a big fan of the fairy tale. Fairy tales, folk tales, the story that your grandmother told you that got passed down from somebody, much older through the generations. Those are the stories, those are the bones for a great novel. And don't worry about making it real complicated, because the complexity comes from the characters.
Yeah, I think a writer that we both admire greatly, Amy Bender, I know when I was taking a class with her, that idea really came through, just how her love of fairy tales and those kind of stories really provided strong bones for some of her greatest stories.
We've got a question from Ruthie, who's asking, what exciting things, Rich, will you be doing during your reign as the LA Beat poet?
Well, if, we weren't in quarantine now, I would obviously be doing a lot more. I would be traveling around and doing that. I mean, being in quarantine, I just try to do whatever outreach I can, and even events like these, just trying to spread the love of poetry and interest in poetry. I've been judging some poetry contests in South Carolina for the South Carolina Poetry Society and different things. So it's at this point, until I can get out and about, it's really communicating either over Zoom or through email, trying to connect with different poets around the world.
I love, I have to say, Beat Poet in Quarantine is like the title to something.
Yeah, I've got a plaque over on my bookshelf, so it reminds me. It's like, yeah, I showed it to I teach 5th grade online right now, and I showed it to my students, and they were like, yeah, whatever that means, that's fine. Are you going to give us homework tonight? It's like, okay. That kind of like humbled, brought me down to like, okay, yeah, I'm still a guy here in this apartment. So, no, but it's cool. I can't wait to be able to travel.
We've got a great question from my Diana Butler, who says, I've often called you my guru. One of the things that bothered me and kept me from seeking publication was when one person told me that once I put it out there, it would no longer belong to me and now was open to interpretation by those who read it. I thought back at my English lit classes and how we dissected great works, arguing in the class as to what one phrase meant or another meant. I couldn't get past that. Have you ever felt that kind of hesitation with your work?
Hey, Diana, by the way, thanks for being here. Again, this was a conversation I was just having with my dear friend that we were talking about the Memory Palace and about how people interpret work. And, a story that I told was, there was an interview with Michael Stipe from REM some years ago, and when they were touring and he would mumble a lot, especially in the early days of REM, and people would interpret their lyrics in different ways. And sometimes, fans would write to them or communicate with them in some way and be like, is this what you're saying in those song lyrics? And he would be like, wow, I really like your interpretation much better than mine. I think I'm going to sing what you say at some of our shows. And they would just adopt, some lyrics from fans and do that. But I think it's kind of cool, actually, when your work is open to different interpretations. I mean, that's, what we do if we go to a museum and see art, or if we read a poem or something. I mean, sometimes I feel like with some of my poems that maybe I sometimes nail things on the head too much. Whereas, it's kind of cool to have things open to different interpretations where one person can see it one way, one person can see it another way. And Diana, there used to be a time where I think I was more self-conscious about putting certain things out into the world. I think it was more so when I was playing in bands and like, especially when we were trying to get like record label contracts or whatever. And we got really like, oh my God, like, are we going to write the song that the label's going to like or whatever? And ultimately that didn't serve anybody, because once we started thinking like we've got to create something that we think someone else is going to like, it just killed it. It killed the joy of creating it. And those things actually didn't end up being very good in the long run. But just the things that came through that were more liberating, that were just like, I'm just going to put this out there and people can, interpret it however they want to go. And I'm just going to let it go. Let it go. Let it be out there. What about you, Stephanie?
Yeah, I feel the same way. I continue to be thrilled to be published. I'm thrilled when my work gets accepted and gets out there, and I hope people like it and find it interesting. And what they make of it is up to them. This is kind of, you were talking about playing, and I think my work, I want people to play with it and have ideas and maybe make their own work too, and kind of out it goes. I love the thought that it's going to maybe become something else for somebody different.
Okay, so we got time for just one last question before we make a very special announcement and say our goodbyes. And so both of you teach very different demographics, but you are both teachers, and curious about when it comes to poetry, whether it's about creating it or enjoying it, is there a key sentiment that you always try to instill into your students?
Stephanie, why don't you first start on this, because I think you actively teach more poetry than I do, and I would love to hear your thoughts on this anyway too, because I've studied with you, Stephanie.
That's such a fabulous question, Teresa. For poetry, what I really want people to do is notice, to notice things, and to write about what they notice. Because poetry, as opposed to, if we've been talking about poetry versus fiction, poetry is about the image. It's about what you see, smell, taste, touch. It's about that. And it's about deepening that experience for yourself and for your reader. So that's, I think that, and that's true for poets around the world, Chinese, Japanese, Mexican, the Calderon, to writers like Kathleen Alcala, to, I mean, it's about the image. So
Hey,
that's the thing, my thing.
Stephanie, do you have any tips or whatever, like if writers come to you and say, hey Stephanie, I'm stuck on an idea, or like, do you have any ideas on like how I can jumpstart my writing? I'm in quarantine now and I've got writer's block or whatever, like what can I do?
A exercise that I love to use with writers, and I'm looking for my book, it's somewhere too far to reach, but is an exercise taken from, I think it's called 13 Ways of Looking for a Poem. And it's an exercise where you take a potted plant and you write about it. And first you describe it as minutely as possible. That's the first thing, part of the exercise. Then you talk about what kind of plant it is. You maybe do some research into it on Wikipedia. It's like, it's this kind of a cactus, let's say. You write about that. Then you write about the history of the plant, which you may make up. And then at the end, you write about the plant from the point of view of the plant. And then you take that back to compression. You take all of that and you compress it any way you want, and that's your poem. and it pretty much generally always works.
Nice. Speaking of writing from the voice of a plant, Stephanie, have you ever heard of that collection by Francis Ponge called The Voice of Things?
I have.
Yeah. Those of you that might not be familiar with it, he writes literally through the voice of things, like the door or the doorknob or whatever. And it's these brilliant poems.
All right, so I think that's the last question we've got. So I know we have an announcement to make, and then afterwards, we'll end the evening. But if Stephanie or Rich, you would?
Yeah, we have a virtual wine and cheese set up.
Right, yes, right. Over this way, this way.
That's one of the things I miss about live readings. Where's the wine and cheese?
Have it afterwards. I am very, very excited to share that Rich and Teresa and I have talked about how we would like to honor the memory of wonderful Liz Neustadt.
Woohoo.
And in her honor, we are going to restart our co-hosted monthly poetry series, and we're going to call it the Elizabeth Neustadt Monthly Poetry Series. And so stay tuned for information about that, because we're very psyched to do it. And thank you so much to Chevalier Books and Teresa for supporting us.
Yeah, thank you, Teresa. And thank you, Stephanie, for coming up with the idea. It's going to be great.
All right, so thank you both, Stephanie and Rich. Thank you for sharing your time and your wisdom and your energy tonight. Before we say goodbye, I do want to mention one more time that you can get a signed copy of Everything is Radiant Between the Hates at Chevalier's Books. You can go to our website, chevaliersbooks.com. You can click on the link in the chat box, or you can just swing on by and we'll make sure that you get your copy. So one last time, thank you both. Any last words before we all leave this meeting?
Thank you, Rich. You're brilliant.
Likewise, Stephanie, and thanks to all of you for coming out from all over the place.
Thanks.
I know you're all over the place. Thank you. And again, Teresa, thank you to Chevalier. Support your local indie bookstores, whether in person, online. If you go, wear a mask. But yeah.
All right, everyone, have a great rest of your